A legendary Texas Ranger watches silently as a brutal motorcycle gang terrorizes his small town. But when they push him too far, he discovers his greatest enemy is the teenager he failed to save 20 years ago. Now, he must choose between violent revenge or breaking a cycle that he helped create. The thundering roar of motorcycles shattered the peaceful afternoon in Cedar Creek, Texas. Chrome gleamed under the merciless sun as a dozen riders tore through Main Street, their machines leaving black streaks on the sun-baked asphalt. Store owners rushed to pull their shutters down. Mothers hurried their children inside, and the few brave souls who remained on the sidewalks pressed themselves against building walls, trying to become invisible. From his rocking chair on the porch of Mason's General Store, 70-year-old Jack Wheeler watched the chaos unfold with unnaturally steady eyes. His weathered hands rested motionless on his lap, neither trembling nor clenching as the gang members kicked over trash cans and shattered the windows of Mr. Peterson's bakery. The old man's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his steel-gray eyes, a ghost of the man he used to be. "Get out here, old man!" One of the riders bellowed at Sheriff Thompson, who stood frozen in the doorway of the police station. The gang leader, a massive figure with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, circled his bike menacingly around the law enforcement building. "This is our town now." Sheriff Thompson's hand hovered near his holster, but he knew better. 6 months of terrorizing had taught the town its place. His deputies, all 3 of them, stood behind him, their faces masks of frustration and helplessness. "If only he was still around," Thompson muttered, his eyes inadvertently drifting toward Jack Wheeler's distant figure. "If only—" The old man on the porch had heard those words before. 20 years as a Texas Ranger had earned him a reputation that still echoed through these parts. But Jack Wheeler had hung up his badge and gun long ago. These days, he preferred the company of his memories and regrets to that of people. Yet as he watched the gang members terrorize his town, something stirred within him, something he'd thought long buried. A young woman's scream pierced the air as one of the riders grabbed her purse, dragging her several feet before letting go. Jack's fingers twitched, muscle memory from decades of law enforcement threatening to override his self-imposed exile. The gang roared away as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind broken glass, terrified citizens, and a tension that hung in the air like smoke after a wildfire. Jack Wheeler remained in his chair, still as a statue, while the town picked up its pieces once again. The setting sun cast long shadows across Jack Wheeler's modest ranch house on the outskirts of Cedar Creek. Inside, his calloused fingers traced the outline of an old photograph, a younger version of himself standing proud in his Texas Ranger uniform, flanked by fellow officers at a ceremony 25 years ago. The memories came unbidden, like they always did at this hour. The weight of the badge on his chest, the responsibility it carried, the lives he'd saved, and the ones he couldn't. 1992, El Paso border. The desert heat had been merciless that day. Jack, then a seasoned ranger with 15 years under his belt, tracked a notorious drug cartel through the unforgiving terrain. His team moved like shadows across the landscape, closing in on their target after months of careful investigation. Wheeler, his partner Mike Dawson, had whispered, "We've got movement at 3 o'clock." The operation should have been straightforward. They'd done hundreds like it before, but nobody could have predicted the cartel's new military-grade weapons or the civilian bus that would stumble into the crossfire. Jack's jaw clenched at the memory. 17 civilians had been caught in the middle of that firefight. While his quick thinking had saved most of them, 3 hadn't made it. The faces of those lost souls still haunted his dreams, their names etched permanently in his conscience. Maria Gonzalez, age 8, Thomas Reed, age 64, Sarah Martinez, age 32, 2002, Houston. Another flash. A warehouse raid gone wrong. His instincts had screamed that something was off, but pressure from above forced their hand. 2 young rangers, fresh out of training, paid the price for that rushed decision. Jack had carried Tommy Jensen's body out himself, the kid's blood soaking through his uniform. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did that day. The brass called it acceptable losses in the line of duty. Jack called it failure. Standing from his worn leather armchair, he moved to the gun safe, hidden behind a landscape painting. The combination came automatically, May 17, '82, the date he'd first pinned on his badge. Inside, his service weapon lay untouched, gathering dust alongside his commendations and medals. His fingers ghosted over the grip of the .45, muscle memory making them twitch. 20 years of active duty had honed his shooting skills to near perfection. Even now, at 70, he could probably outshoot most men half his age. The thought brought no pride, only a deep weariness. A motorcycle's roar in the distance drew his attention to the window. The gang was making their nightly rounds, marking their territory like rabid dogs. Jack watched their headlights cut through the darkness, his expression unreadable. The town whispered about him, he knew. They remembered the legend, the ranger, who'd brought down the Santiago cartel, who'd broken up the largest human trafficking ring in Texas history, who'd never lost a man under his command until that day in Houston. They wondered why he chose solitude over service, peace over purpose. But they didn't understand the cost of violence, even justified violence. They hadn't seen what he'd seen, hadn't carried the weight he'd carried. Each life he'd taken in the line of duty, and there had been many, left its mark on his soul. Each decision to pull the trigger, even when necessary, added another brick to the wall he'd built around himself. The sound of breaking glass echoed from town, followed by distant laughter. Jack closed the gun safe, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd chosen this life of quiet contemplation for a reason. The world had enough violence without him adding to it. Yet as he settled back into his chair, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that sometimes peace came at too high a price. Sometimes, the choice to do nothing was itself an act of violence. Jack pushed the thought away, like he had so many times before. But tonight, as the gang's engines faded into the distance and the town held its collective breath, that voice grew a little louder, a little more insistent. The old ranger closed his eyes, but sleep, as usual, would prove elusive. Cedar Creek had always been the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked at night, a place where neighbors knew each other's children by name, where Friday night football games drew the entire community together, and where the biggest crime used to be teenagers sneaking beers behind the old mill. But that Cedar Creek was fading like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Main Street told the story better than words could. Thompson's hardware store, a fixture since 1952, now sported plywood where its display window used to be. The neon sign of Mary's Diner flickered weakly, half its letters broken from a recent accident. Even the town square's proud oak trees bore scars. Motorcycle chains had stripped away chunks of bark, leaving ugly wounds in the ancient wood. Inside the diner, Sheriff Thompson sat at his usual corner booth, coffee growing cold before him. Through the streaked windows, he watched Mrs. Chen hurriedly closing her alteration shop at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours earlier than normal. Ever since the gang had visited her store last week, she'd been closing before sunset. "More coffee, Sheriff," Sarah, the waitress, asked. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pot, and Thompson noticed fresh bruises on her wrist, likely from when she'd refused to serve one of the gang members yesterday. "They're getting bolder," Deputy Martinez said, sliding into the booth across from Thompson. The young officer's usual energy was dampened, his uniform wrinkled from another sleepless night on patrol. "They broke into the school last night, trashed the gymnasium." Thompson's jaw tightened. "Any witnesses? None willing to talk." Martinez's bitter laugh held no humor. "Same as always." The bell above the diner's door chimed as Mayor Wilson entered, his normally pristine suit showing signs of wear. The past 6 months had aged him a decade. He joined them without invitation, his voice low and urgent. "We need to do something, David," the mayor said, using the sheriff's first name, a sign of how far formality had fallen. "The business owners are talking about closing up shop. Peterson's already listing his bakery for sale." "What would you have me do, James?" Thompson gestured to Martinez. "I've got 3 deputies. They've got 15 men, military-grade weapons, and absolutely nothing to lose. You saw what happened in Millbrook when their police tried to stand up to them." The mayor winced. Everyone had heard about Millbrook. The neighboring town's police station still bore the scorch marks. Through the window, they watched as old Jack Wheeler crossed the street, heading toward Mason's general store. A pair of gang members lounged against their bikes nearby, watching him with predatory interest. But something in the old man's bearing, perhaps the way he moved, deliberate and unafraid, made them look away first. "There's your answer," Mayor Wilson muttered, nodding toward Wheeler. "He's done this before, handled worse than these thugs." Thompson shook his head. "He's made it clear he's retired. Besides, He's 70 years old. A 70-year-old Texas Ranger with more experience than this entire town combined, the mayor countered. You've heard the stories. Hell, you were there for some of them. Before Thompson could respond, the roar of motorcycles filled the air. The diner fell silent as 3 bikes pulled up outside. Sarah dropped her coffee pot, ceramic shards scattering across the floor like broken promises. Through the window, they watched as the gang members swaggered into Mason's store. Old Jack was still inside. Thompson half rose from his seat, but Martinez grabbed his arm. Don't, the deputy warned. We'll only make it worse. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of laughter from inside the store. 5 minutes later, the gang members emerged, carrying cases of beer they hadn't paid for. Old Jack followed them out, his face impassive as they mounted their bikes. See? One of them called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Even the famous Texas Ranger knows better than to cause trouble. As the bikes roared away, Thompson watched Jack Wheeler stand motionless on the sidewalk, his eyes following the disappearing riders. For just a moment, something flickered across the old man's face, something that reminded Thompson of the Ranger he used to know. But then it was gone, and Wheeler turned back into the store as if nothing had happened, leaving the town to its quiet desperation. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon right in front of the post office. Jack Wheeler had just collected his mail, mostly bills and a letter from his sister in Austin, when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. 3 bikes pulled up to the curb, their riders eyeing him with the calculated interest of vultures sizing up potential prey. Jack recognized the snake-tattooed leader from previous encounters, though they'd never directly crossed paths. Well, well, the leader drawled, killing his engine. If it ain't the famous Jack Wheeler himself. He swung off his bike with exaggerated care. Boys, show some respect. We're in the presence of a genuine Texas Ranger. Former Ranger, Jack corrected quietly, tucking his mail into his jacket pocket. His voice, though aged, carried the same steady authority it had 20 years ago. That's right, former. The leader's smile didn't reach his eyes. Must be eating you alive, old man, watching us run this town while you hide behind your retirement. Jack met his gaze evenly but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some dogs bark just to hear themselves make noise. The confrontation might have ended there if young Tommy Chen hadn't chosen that moment to round the corner on his bicycle. The 17-year-old was Mrs. Chen's only son, a bright kid with dreams of medical school. Tommy skidded to a stop, taking in the scene. His eyes darted between Jack and the gang members, fear warring with something else on his face, something dangerous like courage. Leave him alone, Tommy said, his voice cracking slightly. He's done nothing to you. The leader's amusement vanished like smoke in the wind. What did you say, boy? I said leave him alone. Tommy's voice was stronger now, though his hands shook where they gripped his handlebars. You can't just keep bullying everyone. Jack felt his muscles tense as the gang members exchanged looks. He knew what was coming before it happened, saw the violence building like a thunderhead. Tommy, he said softly, go home. But it was too late. The leader nodded to his companions, and they moved with practiced efficiency. One knocked the bike out from under Tommy, while another grabbed him before he could fall. The leader approached slowly, cracking his knuckles. Seems like somebody needs to learn some manners. Jack's hand twitched toward a weapon he no longer carried. 20 years of training screamed at him to act, to stop what was about to happen, but the weight of his past decisions held him in place like concrete shoes. The first punch doubled Tommy over. The second split his lip. By the third, the boy had stopped struggling, hanging limp in his captor's grip. Stop! Jack's voice cut through the air like a blade. The leader paused, fist raised for another strike. Or what, old man? You gonna come out of retirement for this little hero? He grabbed Tommy's hair, forcing the boy's head up. Look at him, Wheeler. Look at what happens when people don't respect the new order. Jack stood motionless, his face a mask of stone as they continued their work. When they finally tired of their sport, they dropped Tommy to the sidewalk like a discarded toy. The leader mounted his bike, then turned to Jack one last time. Remember this moment, Ranger. Remember that you stood there and did nothing. That's who you are now. The motorcycles roared away, leaving behind the taste of exhaust and shame. Jack knelt beside Tommy, who was trying unsuccessfully to push himself up from the concrete. Don't move, son, he said gently, pulling out his phone to call for help. Just stay still." Tommy's one good eye focused on him, filled with a mixture of pain and accusation that hit harder than any physical blow. "Why? Why didn't you help me?" Jack had no answer. He stayed with Tommy until the ambulance arrived, helped him onto the stretcher, and watched as the red and white vehicle pulled away, its sirens cutting through the afternoon quiet. Standing alone on the blood-speckled sidewalk, Jack Wheeler felt something shift inside him, a fault line finally giving way after years of pressure. The weight of his inaction pressed down on him like a physical thing, forcing him to acknowledge a truth he'd been avoiding. Sometimes the price of peace was too high. He turned toward home, his steps measured and deliberate. Behind him, a small crowd of townspeople who'd witnessed everything dispersed quickly, their whispered conversations carrying disappointment and something else: the death of hope. The attack on Tommy Chen opened a floodgate. Over the next week, Cedar Creek witnessed an escalation that made previous months look tame by comparison. The gang, emboldened by their public display of brutality, seemed determined to push the boundaries even further. From his kitchen window, Jack watched the town's transformation through the lens of his morning coffee ritual. Monday, Miller's pharmacy ransacked, prescription drugs stolen. Tuesday, 3 cars torched in the high school parking lot. Wednesday, the local bank's ATM ripped from the wall using chains and a pickup truck. But it was the small things that truly showed how far things had deteriorated. The playground, once filled with children's laughter, stood empty even on sunny afternoons. The weekly farmers market, a tradition since 1965, canceled indefinitely. Church services moved to private homes because people were afraid to gather in public. Jack methodically gathered information, old habits refusing to die. He noticed patterns in their movements, tracked their routines. The gang wasn't just random thugs, they operated with military precision. Their leader, the one with the snake tattoo, maintained strict discipline among his men. They patrolled in shifts, maintained regular communication, and always traveled in groups of at least 3. They're ex-military, Jack muttered to himself one evening, watching through binoculars as they executed a perfectly coordinated harassment of a local business. Probably discharged, dishonorable most likely. A knock at his door interrupted his surveillance. It was Mike Dawson, his former partner from the Rangers, now retired and living just outside town. "Thought I might find you playing watchdog," Mike said, settling into a chair next to Jack. He looked older than his 65 years, worry lines etched deep in his face. "Heard about the Chen boy?" Jack's jaw tightened. "He's still in the hospital. His mother's closing the shop, moving to Houston to live with relatives." Mike paused, letting that sink in. "She's not the only one leaving. Town's bleeding out, Jack. I know. Do you?" Mike's voice carried an edge. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're doing a hell of a lot of watching and not much else." Jack set down his binoculars. "What would you have me do, Mike? I'm 70 years old. You're the best tactical mind I've ever worked with. Age hasn't changed that." Mike leaned forward. "I did some digging on our snake-tattooed friend. Name's Marcus Cole, former Force Recon. Dishonorably discharged in 2019 for excessive force and conduct unbecoming." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You've been investigating. Someone had to. He's got 11 men, all ex-military. They've hit 3 other towns before this one, always the same pattern. Move in, establish dominance, drain the place dry, then move on to the next target." Through the window, they watched as 2 gang members forced their way into the closed diner. Sarah's scream echoed across the street. "They're getting worse," Mike continued. "It's only a matter of time before someone dies. You know that better than anyone." Jack remained silent, his fingers absently tracing the outline of his old service weapon through his jacket, a habit he'd never quite broken. "Remember Laredo?" Mike asked quietly. "The cartel had us pinned down, outgunned, outnumbered. Everyone said we should wait for backup. That was different." "Was it? You said something that day I never forgot. You said sometimes waiting for the perfect moment means missing the only moment you have." The diner's door burst open, and Sarah ran out, clutching her torn uniform around her. The gang members' laughter followed her down the street. Jack's hand clenched into a fist. "I made a promise, Mike, no more violence." "And how's that working out?" Mike stood, heading for the door. "You made another promise too when you pinned on that badge. Just because you took it off doesn't mean that promise expired." He paused at the threshold. "Cole's planning something big. Word is he's called in reinforcements from other chapters. Whatever's coming, it's going to make everything so far look like a church picnic. After Mike left, Jack sat in the growing darkness, watching the town he'd known for 40 years transform into something unrecognizable. In the distance, more motorcycles roared, their sound like wolves howling at the moon. He thought about Tommy Chen's accusing eyes, about Sarah's scream, about Mrs. Chen closing her shop, about promises made and broken, and the fine line between peace and cowardice. The weight of his service weapon seemed heavier than usual against his side, like it was waiting for a decision. The bell above Frank's auto shop jingled as Jack pushed through the door, bringing with him the scent of approaching rain. Frank Martinez looked up from the engine he was working on, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Haven't seen you in here since your truck broke down last spring." Jack's eyes swept the garage, noting the security cameras, reinforced doors, and the shotgun poorly hidden behind the counter. Frank had been preparing for something. "Your boy still works at the gun range in Austin?" Jack asked without preamble. Frank's smile faded. "You know he does." He studied Jack's face carefully. "Why?" "I need supplies, off the books." The mechanic's eyes narrowed. "Thought you were retired." "So did I." Frank nodded slowly, then walked to the garage door, lowering it with a metallic clang that echoed through the space. He moved to a workbench and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 cups. "About damn time," he said, pouring them each a measure. "I've got a storage unit outside town. Been stockpiling since these bastards showed up. Nothing illegal, but let's say I like to be prepared." Jack took the offered drink but didn't sip it. "I need more than supplies, Frank. I need people, reliable ones." "Got a list?" Frank pulled up a stool. Jack produced a folded paper from his pocket. 5 names. Frank read them, nodding at each one. "Good choices. Bill Thompson's boy at the hardware store. Kid's a former Marine. Sarah from the diner was state shooting champion 3 years running before she had to quit to care for her mom. Doc Wilson's got medical training, obviously. Mike Dawson's a given." He paused at the last name. "You sure about Jenkins?" "The locksmith?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "No, he's been doing more than just cutting keys. He's got cameras all over town, watching the gang's movements, been keeping detailed logs of their patterns." Jack allowed himself a small smile. He'd chosen well. Over the next hour, they planned. Frank made calls, careful ones, using code words that wouldn't raise suspicion if intercepted. One by one, their recruits arrived, taking different routes, timing their entrances to avoid attention. By midnight, they were all assembled in Frank's back office. Sarah, still sporting bruises from the diner incident, sat rigid in her chair. Bill Thompson Jr. leaned against the wall, his military bearing evident in his posture. Doc Wilson looked tired but determined, while Jenkins nervously adjusted his glasses. Mike Dawson completed the group, standing beside Jack like old times. "What we're discussing doesn't leave this room," Jack began, his voice quiet but commanding. "Anyone who wants to walk away, do it now. No judgment, no questions asked." No one moved. "These men aren't just thugs," he continued. "They're trained, organized, and well-equipped. Taking them head-on would be suicide. We need to be smarter, more strategic." He unrolled a map of Cedar Creek on Frank's workbench. "Jenkins, show me where your cameras are." The locksmith stepped forward, marking locations with a red pen. "They've established 3 main bases of operation: the old mill, the abandoned drive-in theater, and surprisingly, the basement of the Methodist church." "They're expanding," Sarah added, her voice hard. "I've overheard them talking about bringing in more members, at least 20 more, maybe by the end of the week." Jack studied the map, his mind working through scenarios. "We can't wait that long. Frank, what kind of supplies are we looking at?" The mechanic listed their resources: body armor, communication equipment, non-lethal weapons, and a few carefully maintained firearms. Not enough for a direct confrontation, but perhaps enough for something more subtle. "This isn't about winning a war," Jack explained, looking each person in the eye. "It's about making Cedar Creek too costly for them to keep. We hit their operations, disrupt their supply lines, make them uncomfortable, but we do it smart, we do it careful, and above all, we do it together." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Training starts tomorrow at dawn. Frank's garage, back entrance. Anyone not completely committed, walk away now. Once we start, there's no turning back." The room remained silent. each face set with determination. "One more thing," Jack added, his voice taking on an edge they hadn't heard before. "We're not vigilantes. We're not murderers. We're citizens protecting our home. Remember that." As the group dispersed, leaving one by one as carefully as they'd arrived, Mike stayed behind. "Just like old times," he said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. Jack watched the others disappear into the night. "No," he replied quietly. "This time we do it right." Dawn broke over Frank's garage, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Inside, Jack watched his small group of recruits assemble, each arriving precisely at their designated times. The past 3 days had established a rhythm: arrive separately, train intensively, leave staggered. "Again," Jack commanded, watching Sarah and Bill Jr. practice their hand signals. Communication would be key. In the corner, Jenkins worked with his array of surveillance equipment, teaching Doc Wilson how to monitor the feeds. "They're creatures of habit," Jack explained, pointing to Jenkins's detailed timeline of gang movements. "Every Tuesday they collect protection money. Thursdays they resupply. Sundays they have their big meetings at the church." "Predictability is vulnerability," Mike added, helping Frank modify their radios for secure frequencies. Jack moved among them, adjusting stances, correcting grips, fine-tuning their techniques. Despite their various backgrounds, none had experience in coordinated tactical operations. But what they lacked in training, they made up for in determination. "Remember," he demonstrated a defensive maneuver to Sarah, "you're smaller than them. Use it to your advantage. Let their size work against them." She nodded, executing the move perfectly. The bruises on her arms were fading, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter each day. Frank had transformed his garage into a makeshift command center. The back room now housed maps, surveillance monitors, and communication equipment. Every entrance was secured, escape routes planned, and backup plans established. "They'll expect direct confrontation," Jack explained during their strategy session. "That's their comfort zone. We won't give it to them." He outlined their approach: systematic disruption, cut off their supplies, interfere with their communications, make them waste resources on security, create uncertainty. "Jenkins, show them what you've developed." The locksmith stepped forward, displaying a series of small devices. "Remote-controlled EMPs," he explained. "Small range, but they'll disable their bikes temporarily, untraceable." Bill Jr. studied the building plans of the Methodist Church. "The basement has only 2 exits. If we could seal one..." "Already ahead of you," Frank interjected, producing architectural drawings. "These walls aren't as solid as they look. We can create choke points." Jack watched them work, seeing pieces falling into place. Each person brought unique skills: Sarah's marksmanship, Bill's tactical knowledge, Jenkins's technical expertise, Doc's medical training, Frank's resourcefulness, and Mike's experience. "Remember your pairs," Jack instructed. "No one operates alone. Sarah with Bill, Jenkins with Doc, Frank with Mike. I'll coordinate from central position." They practiced scenarios, running drills in the pre-dawn hours. Jack taught them Rangers techniques adapted for civilian use: how to move unseen, how to observe without being observed, how to predict and counter aggressive actions. "The goal isn't to fight," he reminded them repeatedly. "The goal is to make them leave." By the 4th day, they moved like a unit. Hand signals replaced words. Each person knew their role, their position, their responsibility. Jack watched them transform from scared citizens into a coordinated team. But it was the quiet moments that proved most crucial. During breaks, they shared information about the gang's activities. Sarah reported conversations overheard at the diner. Jenkins showed patterns in their patrol routes. Bill Jr. detailed their weapons based on his military experience. "They're getting nervous," Sarah reported one morning. "Yesterday, 2 of them were arguing about missing supplies. They think someone's stealing from them." Jack nodded. Their preliminary disruptions were working. Small things, sugar in gas tanks, mysterious electrical failures, missing ammunition created tension within the gang's ranks. "They're calling in reinforcements earlier than planned," Jenkins added, checking his surveillance feeds. "Chatter suggests they're moving up their timeline." "Then so are we," Jack decided. He gathered them around the central map. "Tomorrow we start phase 2. Frank, are the supplies in place?" The mechanic nodded. "Everything's ready at the designated points. Jenkins, cameras? All sectors covered, blind spots identified and marked." Jack studied their faces, tired but determined, scared but resolute. They'd come far in a short time, but he worried it might not be enough. "Get some rest," he ordered. "Tomorrow we test everything we've learned. Remember your training. Remember your partners. Remember why we're doing this." As they filed out, Mike lingered behind. "They're ready, Jack." Jack watched through the window as his team dispersed into the early morning light, each taking their practiced routes home. They'll have to be. Cole's not going to wait much longer. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Cedar Creek. In the distance, motorcycles roared, a sound that would soon echo differently through their town. The first real test of their preparation came sooner than expected. On a humid Thursday afternoon, 3 gang members rolled up to Thompson's hardware store, their usual stop for their weekly protection collection. But this time, things went differently. Jack watched from his position at Mason's General Store as Bill Jr. implemented their first coordinated response. Through his earpiece, he heard Jenkins' calm voice. 3 targets, standard formation, Sarah in position. The gang members swaggered into the hardware store, expecting their usual routine. What they found instead was a completely dark store, its windows mysteriously blacked out by new maintenance covers. "Power's out," Bill Jr. at EU's voice crackled through the radio, maintaining his role perfectly. "Can't open the register without power. Might take hours to fix." From her concealed position across the street, Sarah watched through a rifle scope as frustration played across the gang members' faces. They couldn't prove it wasn't a genuine power outage. Jenkins had made sure of that by creating a localized disruption that affected the whole block. "They're calling someone," Jenkins reported from his surveillance position. "Probably Cole." Jack's prediction proved correct. Within 10 minutes, 2 more motorcycles arrived, including the snake-tattooed leader himself. Cole circled the block once, his experienced eyes scanning for threats but finding none. Their team had trained for this, staying invisible while maintaining perfect positioning. "Remember," Jack's voice was steady in their earpieces, "let them make the first mistake." That mistake came when Cole, frustrated by the delay, ordered his men to force their way into the store's back entrance. As they moved behind the building, they triggered the first trap, a motion-activated sprinkler system that Frank had modified. Instead of water, it sprayed a mixture that would render their bikes temporarily inoperable within the hour. "Phase 1 complete," Frank confirmed from his position. The gang's response was predictable: anger, threats, and ultimately, property damage. They broke windows and knocked over displays, but found themselves increasingly unnerved by their inability to locate any staff members besides Bill Jr., who maintained his confused, helpless act perfectly. "Something ain't right," they heard Cole say through their surveillance. "Check the other businesses." But each attempt to collect their dues met with similar obstacles. The diner was closed for health inspection. The pharmacy's security system was malfunctioning. The bank's computers were down for maintenance. Jack watched Cole's growing frustration with grim satisfaction. The gang leader wasn't stupid. He knew these weren't coincidences, but he couldn't prove anything was coordinated. The situation escalated when 2 gang members tried to rough up Bill Jr. in retaliation. They found themselves facing not just the former Marine's trained resistance, but also a series of accidents, falling inventory, slippery floors, and mysteriously locking doors that separated them from their backup. "Target 2 is down," Sarah reported calmly, having used her position to shoot a carefully aimed tranquilizer dart. "Clean hit." The remaining gang members, suddenly alone, backed away from Bill Jr. and fled the store. Outside, they could hear Cole's angry shouts as he discovered their motorcycles wouldn't start. "They're calling for pickup," Jenkins informed them, monitoring their communications. 3 vehicles inbound from the church. "Proceed with phase 2, Jack ordered. As the gang waited for their backup, they found themselves dealing with a series of escalating inconveniences. Traffic lights malfunctioned, causing their backup to be delayed. Fire hydrants mysteriously burst, blocking direct routes, and anonymous calls to the state police about suspicious activities ensured unwanted attention. 4 hours without a single successful collection, Mike reported as sunset approached. They're rattled. Jack watched as Cole gathered his men, their frustration evident in their body language. The gang leader kept scanning rooftops and windows, knowing they were being watched but unable to spot anyone. "Send the message," Jack commanded. Moments later, Cole's phone buzzed with a text from an untraceable number. Cedar Creek is no longer profitable. Consider today a warning. They observed as Cole read the message, his face contorting with rage. He fired his gun into the air, their first display of serious violence that day. But the street remained empty. No one showed themselves. No one challenged them. They were fighting shadows. "Pack up," Jack ordered his team. "Maintain observation positions until they clear out." One by one, their team disappeared from their posts, leaving no trace of their presence. They regrouped at Frank's garage an hour later, after taking elaborate precautions to ensure they weren't followed. "They'll retaliate," Mike said, voicing what everyone was thinking. Jack nodded. "Yes, but not tonight. They need to regroup, repair their bikes, restore their image. We've bought ourselves maybe 48 hours. The EMPs worked perfectly," Jenkins reported, reviewing data from his tablets. 6 bikes will need major repairs. "More importantly," Sarah added, "we showed them they're not invincible. Did you see their faces? They're used to being the ones in control." Jack studied his team. They were tired but energized, proud but not overconfident. They'd drawn first blood in this conflict, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. "Get some rest," he ordered. "Tomorrow we prepare for their response. They'll come back harder, angrier, and in greater numbers." As they dispersed into the night, Jack remained behind with Mike, studying their map of Cedar Creek. "Just like Laredo," Mike mused. "Hit them where they ain't, make them fight blind." Jack traced the route back to his house, planning alternate paths. Laredo was different. We had badges then, legal authority. "Maybe," Mike conceded. "But I saw Cole's face when he got that message. He knows he's not dealing with ordinary citizens anymore. He's dealing with someone who knows how to fight." Jack said nothing, but his expression hardened. The first move had been made. Now they would see how Cole responded to being challenged. In the distance, they heard engines roar to life as the gang finally managed to get their damaged bikes running. The sound was angry, promising retribution. The real war for Cedar Creek was about to begin. The retaliation came at dawn, 3 days later. Not with the expected roar of motorcycles, but with the deep rumble of trucks. Through his binoculars, Jack counted 4 heavy-duty pickups and 2 vans, all packed with armed men. Cole had called in his reinforcements, at least 30 new faces among the familiar ones. "Everyone in position," Jack commanded through the radio. "This is what we trained for." They had transformed Cedar Creek during those 3 days. Every alley contained a surprise, every street a potential trap. Frank's mechanical ingenuity, Jenkins' electronics, and Bill Jr. S. tactical knowledge had turned their small town into a carefully orchestrated maze. "They're splitting into teams," Sarah reported from her elevated position in the church bell tower. 4 men per group, moving in a standard sweep pattern. Jack watched as Cole directed his men with military precision. The gang leader had learned from their previous encounter. No more predictable patterns, no isolated targets. "Let them enter the kill box," Jack ordered, using the Rangers' term for their prepared zone. "Wait for my signal." The gang's first team moved down Main Street, weapons ready. They checked doorways, alleyways, rooftops, all the obvious spots, but they weren't looking down. "Now," Jack commanded. The street's drainage covers suddenly burst upward, propelled by compressed air systems Frank had installed. Non-lethal smoke billowed out, engineered by Doc Wilson to cause disorientation without serious harm. The gang members stumbled, cursing and firing blindly into the fog. Team 2, execute. Bill Jr. and his group triggered their sequence. Fire alarms blared from multiple buildings, their synchronized sounds creating a disorienting wall of noise. The gang's communication devices, operating on frequencies Jenkins had identified, suddenly filled with static. "They're splitting up," Sarah reported, "just like you said they would." Cole's voice carried over the chaos, ordering his men to fall back and regroup. But their planned retreat routes were already compromised. Every street they turned down met them with a new obstacle. Roads blocked by abandoned vehicles, alleys filled with construction equipment that hadn't been there yesterday. "They're getting frustrated," Mike observed from his position, "making mistakes." Those mistakes proved costly. 2 gang members, separated from their group, walked right into Sarah's trap. Tranquilizer darts found their marks with precision. Another team, trying to secure high ground, found themselves locked in the courthouse roof access, courtesy of Jenkins' remote-controlled locks. But Cole was adapting quickly. He ordered his remaining men to concentrate their forces, creating a defensive position around their vehicles. He's calling in the rest of them, Jenkins warned, monitoring their frequencies. At least 2 more trucks incoming. Jack watched as Cole organized his defense. The gang leader was better than they'd anticipated. He'd already identified the pattern in their attacks and was adjusting his strategy. Implement contingency 3, Jack ordered. The response was immediate. Fire hydrants burst strategically, turning specific streets into water-filled obstacles. The town's power grid went dark in controlled sections, eliminating the gang's ability to predict safe zones. They're pulling back to the church, Sarah reported, using it as a fortress. Jack allowed himself a grim smile. The church had been prepared for this exact scenario. Its basement, their supposed stronghold, was about to become their prison. All teams, converge on secondary positions, he commanded. Doctor, are the medical supplies in place? Ready for any casualties, Doc Wilson confirmed from his makeshift aid station. The gang's reinforcements arrived to find their main force trapped in an ever-shrinking perimeter. Cole's tactical experience showed as he attempted to coordinate a coherent response, but each move he made was met with a countermove they'd prepared days in advance. Remember, Jack's voice was steady in their earpieces. We're not here to fight them, we're here to break them. The morning sun rose fully over Cedar Creek, illuminating a battlefield unlike anything the town had seen. No direct confrontations, no dramatic shootouts, just the systematic dismantling of a superior force by an invisible opponent. Cole stood in the church doorway, his face a mask of fury, as another of his carefully planned moves was thwarted. He fired his weapon into the air, a gesture of frustration that echoed through the empty streets. "Come out and face us," he shouted, "or are you cowards?" Jack watched from his position, remembering similar situations from his ranger days. But this time was different. This wasn't about law enforcement or personal glory. This was about a community defending itself. "All teams, prepare for final phase," he ordered. "Let's show them exactly who they're dealing with." The real battle for Cedar Creek was about to reach its climax, and Jack Wheeler was finally ready to step out of the shadows. As Cole raged in front of the church, Jack noticed something crucial. The gang leader's snake tattoo shifted, revealing a familiar scar beneath. 20 years of buried memories suddenly surfaced. "Mike," Jack radioed, "it's Marcus Ramirez from the Houston warehouse raid, the teenager who escaped." The revelation hit hard. Marcus Ramirez had become Marcus Cole, and his reign of terror wasn't random. It was revenge. Jenkins quickly confirmed it. Every town Cole's gang had hit connected to former Texas Rangers. Cedar Creek wasn't a target. Jack was. Without warning his team, Jack stepped into the open street, walking unarmed toward Cole. "Hello, Marcus," he called calmly. "Been a long time since Houston." Cole's face twisted with recognition and rage. "You remember me? The kid you used as bait? The one whose brother died because of you?" "Yes," Jack admitted simply. "I made a terrible call that day. One I've carried ever since." The admission seemed to stagger Cole. He'd expected denials, not honesty. "We can keep this cycle going," Jack continued, "or we can end it, right here." The street fell silent. Cole's finger tightened on his trigger, then relaxed. 20 years of hatred warred with the unexpected offer of peace. "You think it's that simple?" Cole asked quietly. "No," Jack replied, "but it's a start." In that moment, both men faced a choice: continue the violence or break a cycle decades in the making. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Creek's main street as Cole's convoy pulled out of town. There had been no dramatic shootout, no final battle, just a long conversation between two men haunted by the same tragic day. In the end, Cole had chosen to leave, taking his men and their wounded with them. Jack stood on the steps of the Methodist church, watching until the last vehicle disappeared over the horizon. His team gathered around him, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Think they'll stay gone?" Sarah asked, lowering her rifle for the first time in hours. "Cole will," Jack replied with quiet certainty. He found what he was really looking for. He turned to face his team. "As for the others, that's why we'll stay prepared." The town slowly came back to life as word spread that the danger had passed. Store owners cautiously reopened their shops. Children ventured back onto the streets. The fear that had gripped Cedar Creek for months began to dissolve like morning mist. "You knew, didn't you?" Mike asked later as they sat on Jack's porch. "You knew there had to be a reason he chose this town." Jack nodded, watching Mrs. Chen and Tommy reopening their shop across the street. Violence creates ripples. Sometimes they come back years later, wearing different faces. The lessons weren't lost on anyone. The town had learned to stand together, to fight smart rather than hard, and most importantly, to face its fears. But they'd also learned something about redemption, how it could come in unexpected ways, through unexpected choices. Jack's team maintained their vigilance, running regular drills and keeping their skills sharp. The security system stayed in place. The emergency plans remained updated. Cedar Creek would never again be an easy target. But something else had changed too. Jack no longer spent his days alone on his porch. He found himself teaching self-defense classes at the community center, sharing his experience with a new generation. The weight of his past felt lighter somehow, transformed from a burden into wisdom he could pass on. Sometimes, he told his students, the bravest thing isn't standing your ground. It's knowing when to offer a hand instead of a fist. Cedar Creek healed, stronger for having faced its trial. And in his quiet moments, Jack Wheeler finally found the peace he'd been seeking, not in isolation, but in connection with the community he'd helped save. The Texas Ranger had come full circle, and this time, he'd gotten it right. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't won with fists or firearms, but with the courage to break cycles of violence and face our past mistakes. How would you have handled it? Would you have chosen revenge, or like Jack Wheeler, found the strength to offer understanding to your greatest enemy? Let us know in the comments below. Click the video on your screen now to continue your journey of self-discovery through more stories of redemption and wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our community of storytellers and truth seekers. Remember, true strength often lies not in the fights we choose to have, but in the ones we choose to end. See you in the next video.